This is section 6. It's the beginning of hypothesis testing. It really is just an extension of what we did in section 5 when we were discussing confidence intervals. But now in this section and section 7, we talk more about what it means to be outside of those confidence intervals. Hypothesis testing is commonly used in research, but it can also be used in making business decisions, such as, is this quarter's average sales significantly higher after implementing a new sales motivation system? Or is the unemployment rate significantly lower this year than last? Or is the average size of a family in a particular city different from a national average? We'd expect that when we sample and test any one of these questions, we'd get different answers just because of random sampling. Hypothesis testing gives us the opportunity to talk about what it means to be different. And it has to be more than just numerically different. It has to be statistically different. So a classic example of hypothesis testing is the guilt or innocence in a court case. For example, is the person innocent or guilty given the evidence presented? To answer this question, we need to define the possible outcomes. These are what are called hypotheses. The null hypothesis is the status quo. This is what is assumed to be true unless you have evidence to the contrary. So, for example, in a jury trial, the defendant is presumed innocent until proven guilty. So we would say that the null hypothesis is that the person is innocent. If we acquit this person, we do not necessarily believe that he or she is innocent. In fact, that's why we use the word acquit. There just may not have been enough evidence to convict them, or we cannot prove the alternative hypothesis. So what is the alternative hypothesis? This is the question you're really trying to answer. This is the research question. So when we have enough evidence that the null is not true, then you reject the null hypothesis and assume that the alternative is true. Now the wording here is going to be critical because we'll never use the words prove. We'll just say that we cannot reject or we fail to reject the null hypothesis. So let's perform a little thought experiment. Let's say that we have an appearance of guilt on a scale from 0 to 100. So 0 meaning they look innocent and 100 meaning they look quite guilty. And imagine that we've presented this evidence to several juries with the same case to determine their evaluation. So the sample size is 12. That's the size of our jury. And in case 1, the person is actually innocent. Now, the jury doesn't know this, but we know this. The jury rates the person on their innocence from 0 to 100, and there's a distribution of the guilt ratings. Now in the case 2, the person is guilty. We know that the person is guilty, the jury does not. Let's let the jury decide, so they once again distribute this guilty rating across these two cases. Now the decision problem here is, since there are some innocent people that look somewhat guilty and some guilty that look somewhat innocent, how do juries determine guilt or innocence, or where is the threshold for a guilty decision? In this case, we've got to determine some decision criteria. So comparing it and assuming that these ratings of guilt or innocence are normally distributed, on the top, we can see that the person is truly innocent, and when the jury rates this person, you can see that the bulk of those ratings are to the left or low. And you would kind of assume that this is an absolute 0 or absolute innocence. But there's some up in here on the right-hand side of that tail that see that there is some evidence that the person may be guilty. Now, in the second case, we have a person that is guilty, and when the jury evaluates the information, they say, boy, this person really does have some guilt involved, and there's evidence to suggest that the person is guilty. But once again, there's still some people that say there's not enough evidence to truly suggest the person is guilty. So we have to define a decision criterion. One of the things I want you to notice is that no matter where we define the decision criterion, we're going to make mistakes. Meaning, if we've defined it where it is now, there is a small probability that, in this case, we would convict an innocent person. And there is also, even though a more significant probability, that we would acquit a guilty person. So we define these as such. If we retain the null hypothesis, and the null hypothesis is true, well, we've made a correct decision. We've released or acquitted an innocent person. If we have rejected the null hypothesis that the person is innocent, so we said, okay, we're going to convict, and the person truly is guilty, once again, we've made a correct decision. However, if we reject a if we reject a true null hypothesis, we commit what is called a type 1 error. And you can kind of think of this as convicting an innocent person. A type 2 error would be the case where we retain or fail to reject the null hypothesis, we acquit the person is actually guilty. So here we would acquit a guilty person. So these are the definitions that we're going to be using. Type 1 meaning that we're going to convict an innocent person. We reject a true null hypothesis. Type 2 errors are where we fail to reject or retain the null hypothesis when it is actually false.